The year is 1018. Kyiv, a city barely recovering from years of bloody civil strife, once again shudders from the thunder of approaching hooves. The armies of the Polish king, Boleslav the Brave, are entering the capital. Riding beside him, returning to the Golden Throne, is the exiled Prince Sviatopolk, the man history will soon dub the Accursed. Amidst the chaos of pillaging and the triumphant roars of the conquerors, one figure remains frighteningly calm. He is neither a warrior nor a member of the princely dynasty. He is an elderly man draped in wealthy garments, the keeper of the keys to the first stone sanctuary of Rust, Church of the Tithes. His name is Anastas of Korsun. He steps out to meet the conquerors, not with a cross, but with the detailed ledgers of the princely treasury. The man to whom Vladimir the Great had entrusted both the finances and the soul of a young empire betrays his heirs without a shadow of a doubt. Anastas hands over to Boleslav not just the gold, but the very hope for stability. He will depart for Poland in the victor's baggage train, taking with him the church tithes and the trust of an entire nation. The personality of this Greek man is utterly baffling. We are accustomed to sweeping historical epics about fiercely loyal retinues and saintly ascetics, but standing behind every great ruler is their own Anastas, a shadow who invariably survives, an opportunist whose razor-sharp mind and total absence of moral barriers shifted the borders of states and altered the destinies of world religions. History remembers him as the traitor of the empire, but the truth is infinitely more complex. Today, we will dissect a massive geopolitical thriller about the man who became the invisible architect of Russian Orthodoxy. In previous episodes, we watched as Sviatoslav Igorovich smashed the Khazar Khaganate and how Princess Olga built a cold, calculating administrative order. We witnessed the blood-soaked path of Vladimir, who seized power in Kyiv through fratricide and violence. But not a single one of them could have executed the most monumental turning point in Eastern European history without the help of this Greek bureaucrat from a besieged city. We are about to find out how a single arrow, loosed from behind city walls, determined the fate of millions of people for 1,000 years to come. We will reconstruct, minute by minute, the siege of Chersonesus, where the fate of Rus hung by a thread over a severed water pipe. You will see why mighty Byzantium, the heir to Rome, found itself in such a deep crisis that Emperor Basil II was forced to beg a barbarian like Vladimir for help, promising him a Porphyrogenita, purple-born imperial princess named Anna as a bride. You will peer into the dark underbelly of Byzantine treachery and understand why the capture of Korsun was not an act of blind aggression, but a calculated method to force the Greeks to honor a treaty. We will break down how the earthen route of city supply lines functioned, and why Byzantine engineers spectacularly lost a psychological war. We will step down into the vaults of the Church of the Tithes, where Anastas, having betrayed his own homeland for Vladimir's sake, managed the princely tithe for decades, engineering the very first system of ecclesiastical taxation in the history of Rus. It is vital to understand this. In the 10th century, religion wasn't merely a matter of saving one's soul. It was a massive technological and legal instrument. Christianity didn't just smell of frankincense, it smelled of the naphtha of Greek fire, of imperial bureaucracy, and of the gold of trade tariffs. Before us lies an era in which Byzantium burned in the flames of Bardas Phokas rebellion, the Pechenegs blockaded the Dnieper rapids, and the ultimate question was being decided within the walls of Korsun. Would Rus remain a loose, fractured alliance of tribes, or would it finally become a formalized part of the European world? The year is 988, a time when one man, standing atop a fortress wall, realized that his old world was dead and decided to build a new one on foreign shores and strictly on his own terms. We are traveling to the white stones of Chersonesus, where, in the long shadows of siege engines, the history of a future empire was forged. Constantinople, 987. The capital of the world, which the northern Varangians spoke of with hushed reverence as Miklagard, the great city. The golden domes of the Hagia Sophia blinded sailors from dozens of miles away before they even reached the docks. Fine silk here was valued cheaper than coarse wool in the barbarian lands. Ships from Venice, Alexandria, and Chersonesus were all moored simultaneously in the harbor of Theodosius. This was the second Rome, and it seemed as though it would outlast time itself. But behind this gilded facade, the empire was suffocating. In the throne room of the Magnora, amidst mechanical lions that roared at foreign guests and golden birds singing on the branches of a bronze tree, sat a man whom history would remember as the Bulgar Slayer. For now he was simply Basil II, 29 years old, with a pale face and a nervous habit of speaking through clenched teeth. Official state documents from that year described the empire's position using a ruthless, mathematically precise formula: the limit of all misfortunes. Look at the map. On the opposite bank of the Bosphorus, in Chrysopolis, incredibly close that the campfires were visible from the palace terraces, stood the battle-hardened legions of Bardas Phokas. He was the greatest military commander of the era. A year prior, he had proclaimed himself emperor and seized almost the entire Asian half of the state. His fleet had blockaded the Dardanelles. The vital grain supply to the capital had been cut off. From the north, the Bulgarians were pressing hard, the very same Bulgarians who, 2 years earlier, in the mountain passes of the gates of Trajan, had turned Basil's army into a bloody pulp of shattered shields and bodies. Inside the city walls, things were even worse. The Byzantine elite, who had spent centuries perfecting the high arts of poison and denunciation, froze in anticipation of a total collapse. The Duke of Antioch, Leo Melisinos, was secretly negotiating with both sides simultaneously. The all-powerful Parakoimomenos, the eunuch Basil Lekapinos, who had effectively ruled the empire from behind the backs of the Basiluses for 30 years, no longer even pretended to submit to the emperor's authority. The imperial guard was unreliable. The court was thoroughly broken. Every single morning, the emperor woke up with the very real thought that today he would be poisoned at breakfast. And it was then that Basil's gaze turned toward the one place from which, for decades, they had received nothing but devastating raids and fire, to the north. He didn't need military commanders betray you. He needed men who didn't know how to read the subtle language of palace intrigue. Warriors loyal not to gold, but to their given word and the weight of their own axes. A third force, wild, external, indomitable. From Constantinople, shrouded in the deepest secrecy, an embassy departed for the north, and while the galleys bearing the imperial seals slipped out into the Black Sea, in the palace chancery, one man was meticulously copying the text of the message into his own personal ledger. A young provincial civil servant from Chersonesus, just passing through the capital. His name means nothing to anyone yet. Anastas. He doesn't know it yet, but in a year this exact correspondence will return to him, delivered on the shaft of an arrow over the walls of a besieged city. The price for the salvation of the empire was announced in Kyiv. Summer 987. The Greek ambassadors ascend the wooden planks of the Kievan docks, draped in fine silk dalmatics, reeking of frankincense, picking their way through rough oak logs and curing bear pelts. They look like time travelers from the future, but there is no arrogance in their eyes, only fear. The sovereign of the Oikumene sent them here not to triumph, but to bargain. Vladimir receives the guests in his gridnitsa, his great hall. Taking their seats before him are men representing a superpower that has just officially acknowledged itself to be at the limit of all misfortunes. And Vladimir names his price. Not gold, not territorial concessions, not favorable trade tariffs. He demands the hand of Anathe, biological sister of the emperor. To fully grasp the sheer audacity of what transpired in that great hall, you need to understand a single Byzantine word, porphyrogenita, the purple-born. This title was given to children born in the porphyry chamber of the Great Palace, a specialized room paved with slabs of deep crimson porphyry stone. But it only applied to those who came into the world when their father was already wearing the imperial crown. This wasn't merely an obscure dynastic detail. It was a mark of the ultimate sacral purity of blood, proof that the child was literally birthed from the empire itself. And there was an ironclad rule that emperors passed down to one another like a holy commandment. A porphyrogenita princess can never become the wife of a barbarian. Never. Under absolutely no circumstances. Charlemagne the Great was refused. Otto of Germany was refused. Peter of Bulgaria was refused. And the Prince of Kyiv, the son of a housekeeper slave named Malusha, a man who, just 5 years prior, was actively offering human sacrifices to the pagan god Perun on a hill overlooking the Dnieper, demands Anna. And he knows they will give her to him. The Greeks present a counter-condition, the only possible stipulation they can lean on to save face. The prince must be baptized. An imperial princess will not marry a pagan. Vladimir agrees without blinking an eye. From the perspective of Byzantine diplomacy, this was a brilliant maneuver, transforming utter humiliation into a missionary victory. From Vladimir's perspective, it was an entirely acceptable price to pay to enter the exclusive club of world monarchs through the front door. From the perspective of both parties, it was a magnificent opportunity to completely deceive each other later. The deal is sealed with wax and metal in the autumn of 987. Golden imperial bullae for Vladimir, silver ones for the treaty documents that will travel back to the capital. Vladimir commits to sending a military corps, not a raiding party, not a few hundred men, but a fully fledged professional army. The number was negotiated separately, and it would echo through history: 6,000 men. While hundreds of hammers echo through the shipyards of the Pochina River in Kyiv, deep within the great palace of Constantinople, Princess Anna has locked herself in her royal chambers. She refers to her impending marriage using words that a chronicler would later record verbatim: "I go as into captivity." To her, the north is quite literally hell. A frozen wasteland without bathhouses, without books, and without God. But Anna is porphyrogenita. Her opinion is neither desired nor requested. Standing in the shadows of the Kievan Great Hall, among the Greek scribes of the embassy, is the man we have already met. Anastas had accompanied the ambassadors as a clerical assistant for correspondence. A provincial Greek from Chersonesus was highly convenient because he spoke fluent Slavic. He remained silent, But he studies Vladimir with far more intensity than the ambassadors themselves. He sees what no one else in either Constantinople or Kyiv sees. This deal will not hold. Someone is going to break their word first. And whoever happens to be in the exact right place at the exact right time will take absolutely everything. The longships cast off from the Kievan shores the following spring. 6,000 men head south, toward the Bosphorus. They are about to prove that the prince wasn't bluffing. First stop, Chrysopolis. June 988. The waters of the Bosphorus darken. Approaching from the Black Sea, driven by a stiff northern wind, hundreds of longships funnel into the narrow throat of the strait. This is no merchant caravan, nor is it an embassy. Standing shoulder to shoulder on the decks are the men Vladimir personally summoned, 6,000 of them. To put this scale into perspective, the personal imperial guard of the Byzantine emperor, the absolute elite of the elite, numbered roughly 4,000 men by 988. The Prince of Kyiv has just sent 1.5 times that number. This isn't the token aid of an ally. This is an independent, sovereign army that is currently dropping anchor against the walls of a foreign capital. Basil II watches the disembarkation from the high terraces of the great palace, and he doesn't smile. He understands perfectly well that, along with his salvation, he has just invited a force into his waters wholly capable of taking Constantinople itself, if they so chose. But his choice is binary. Either risk it with the Varangians, or be slaughtered by his own people. He chooses to risk it, and he doesn't give the northerners a single day to rest. On the opposite shore of the strait, in Chrysopolis, slumbers the sprawling camp of Bardas Phokas the usurper, who is already minting his own silver coins bearing his own profile, directly across from the palace. Every single morning, Basil wakes up and stares at the campfires of the man who feels entitled to sit on his throne. The crossing happens under the cover of night. In the pre-dawn fog, the Russian longships silently glide up to the Asian shore. No battle cries, no roaring signal horns. The Battle of Chrysopolis is not a battle. It is a slaughter. The Varangians form a brutal shield wall and methodically crush the rebel legions, driving them backward into the water. Their primary weapon is the heavy two-handed broadaxe, the Dane axe, boasting a blade 2 palms wide. The Byzantine lamellar armor, engineered perfectly to deflect the slicing blow of an Arab saber, simply crumples under these crushing downward strikes like wet clay. Phokas army-hardened veterans of the Syrian and Mesopotamian campaigns succumbs to primal terror. Nicephorus Phokas, the brother of the usurper, is captured right in his own tent before he even has time to pull on his boots. But victory isn't enough for Basil. He requires a spectacle. On his explicit personal orders, the commander of the rebel forces, Kalokiros Delphinas, is impaled on a stake in full view of the entire city. This isn't just an execution. It is the defining decree of his new reign. The era of compromises has ended. Bardas Phokas himself slips away. He retreats westward, toward the Dardanelles, locking himself in the fortress of Abydos, and there he rallies whatever shattered remnants of his forces he has left. The empire remains fractured in two. April 13th, 989. Abydos. The decisive clash. This time, Basil leads the army personally, and its iron core consists of those same 6,000 Rus, who now intimately understand exactly how Byzantine battle formations function from the inside. At night, the imperial fleet glides up to the rebel anchorage and incinerates their ships, using Greek fire, that legendary naphtha-based incendiary weapon whose recipe was known to exactly 3 men in the empire, men who would routinely die without passing it on to anyone. While the ships burn to ash, the Varangians chew through Phokas' defensive lines on the shore. And then the usurper does what all men do when they realize they have fundamentally lost. He bets absolutely everything on a single, desperate strike. Bardas Phokasa, massive man clad in gilded lamellar armor, seated atop a hulking war horse, breaks out of his own ranks and drives his horse directly toward the spot where the imperial banner flutters above the host, directly toward where Basil is standing. One strike, one single combat. This is how wars were decided in the age of Homer, and Phokas, like a true Byzantine aristocrat enamored with classical antiquity, chooses precisely this kind of death. And then something happens that chroniclers will never be able to rationally explain. In the no man's land between the two armies, at full gallop, a mere 50 yards from the emperor, Bardas Phokas suddenly slumps in his saddle. He isn't struck by an arrow. He isn't clipped by a sword. He simply sags slowly from his horse into the choking dust and never gets back up. Contemporaries aggressively whispered about poison slipped into his morning wine. Basil kept the finest poisoners in the empire on his payroll. Later historians would theorize about a massive heart attack or a stroke. But to the 6,000 Varangians standing shoulder to shoulder in the shield wall, it looked like exactly one thing. Their new employer was clearly favored by the heavens far more than his enemy. The sudden death of their leader breaks the rebels in a matter of minutes. The Battle of Abydos ends in a total crushing triumph for Basil. He returns to the capital as a victorious conqueror. For the first time in 3 years, he sleeps without armed guards standing outside his bedchamber door. The usurpers are dead. The vital Asian provinces are returning under the shadow of the imperial eagle, and the Bulgarians are retreating back to the north. His power is no longer propped up by whispering eunuchs or court intriguers, but by 6,000 blood-soaked axes, and the most terrifying thing about those axes is that they don't actually belong to him. They belong to a man sitting in Kyiv, a man who is waiting for what he was promised. And it is precisely here that Basil's Byzantine nature overrides what the barbarian world calls honor. The terror had passed, and taking the terror with it, the willingness to pay simply vanished. The emperor gazes to the north, toward Kyiv, and for the first time in 2 years, allows himself to vocalize what the court has been secretly thinking all along. Why exactly should we do this? Why hand over the sacred blood of Rome, blood birthed in the porphyry Chamberto, the bastard son of a slave? The enemies are vanquished. The Varangians will be handed their silver, like any common mercenaries, and they will go home. Anna will remain in Constantinople. In 5 years, no one will even remember this treaty. This is how the emperor rationalizes it. He forgets only one minor detail. When the Greek embassy returned from Kyiv in the autumn of 987, sitting among its scribes was an unremarkable provincial civil servant from Chersonesus, the assistant for Slavic correspondence. This man had observed Vladimir up close. He had listened to how the prince spoke. He had memorized how the prince remained silent. And he knows, with absolute chilling certainty, a prince who was promised a purple-born bride and didn't receive her is not going to send a letter of protest. He is going to send a fleet. While triumphal feasts echo through the great palace, and Basil leisurely ponders the most elegant diplomatic formulas with which to phrase his refusal, the hammers are already ringing out again in Kyiv. Vladimir isn't waiting for an answer. He already knows it. The target of his new campaign will not be Constantinople. It is too far away, and its walls are too formidable. The target will be the closest pearl in the imperial crown, the Eye of Byzantium in the Black Sea, the city through which every second sack of grain and every third amphora of wine flows to the capital, Chersonesus, Korsun. And behind the towering walls of that very city, in the house of the Protewan, the man whose name we have already spoken twice is meticulously packing his ledgers into a leather case, and, for the first time in many years, he smiles. Anastas realizes the empire has just made a move that will cost them the entirety of Crimea, and he is the one who will have to play this move out to its conclusion. Spring 988, Chersonesus. Picture a flawless block of white marble tossed into a boiling cauldron of black pitch. That is exactly what Korsunus the Rus call it looks like on the northern shores of the Pontus Euxinus, the very last bastion of ancient classical civilization completely encircled by the wild fields. While tribal chieftains in the northern forests are still violently arguing over the right to collect tribute in animal pelts, here, behind a double ring of fortified walls, men read Homer, debate the esoteric nuances of the Eucharist, and drink ice-cold water channeled from underground springs. To Constantinople, this is no mere province. This is the eye of the empire, the sole vantage point from which Byzantium can monitor everything happening north of the Black Sea. From here, imperial strategoi have played their geopolitical games for decades, pitting the Pechenegs against the Rus, intercepting Khazar merchant caravans, and reporting back to the capital about every single longship that travels down the Dnieper. In Prince Igor's Treaty of 944, a humiliating clause for Rus was preserved. The Rus were strictly forbidden from wintering in the mouth of the Dnieper, expressly so they wouldn't disturb the Chersonesian fishermen. This was how the empire guarded the peace of its northernmost outpost. The city is sustained by water from natural springs lying far beyond its walls, nestled in the eastern hills. The water travels through thick lead pipes, buried deep underground. The citizens of Korsun are absolutely certain this system is entirely untouchable by any enemy force. It is their greatest source of pride, and it is their single, fatal weakness. In the bustling port of the Quarantine Bay, it's business as usual for the spring season. Kuberia and Chilandia, fat-bellied merchant vessels with their slanted lateen sails, are offloading amphorae of wine from Trebizond, heavy bales of silk from Constantinople, and dense sacks of salt that will journey outward from here to Kyiv, to Novgorod, and to the Bulgars on the Volga. The city breathes. There is no war here. But inside a small stone house built into the southern slope of the hill, in a room with 2 windows overlooking the harbor, sits a man who has been suffering from insomnia since last week. His name is Anastas. He is around 40 years old. He wears the modest yet unmistakably expensive dark robes of a high-ranking city official. Resting on the desk before him is a wooden board coated in smooth wax, a stylus, and a letter. The letter arrived the day before yesterday via a merchant ship from Constantinople. This is not an official state dispatch. It's just a casual note from an old friend, a mid-level bureaucrat, exactly like him, working in the palace chancery. Letters like these are typically filled with court gossip, requests to send a crate of good wine, and evasive, general complaints about the drudgery of life. But this letter contains something else. The friend writes that last autumn, an embassy from Kyiv arrived at the great palace, that the barbarian prince is explicitly demanding the hand of the Porphyrogenita, Anna, that the emperor, can you imagine, actually agreed, that the northern military corps is already fighting in Asia and butchering Phokas rebels, that the entire chancery is buzzing with the news. And this is the very last line of the letter, hastily scribbled in passing between a complaint about the rising cost of charcoal and sending his regards to Anastas' wife, that the princess's departure to Kyiv has, for some vague reason, been postponed. Nobody knows for how long. His friend doesn't understand what he has just written. Anastas understands completely. To understand what this provincial civil servant in Chersonesus saw in those seemingly innocuous lines, you have to understand how Anastas views the world. He doesn't view the world as a mere sequence of events. He views the world as a sprawling ledger of causes and effects. For 20 years, he has meticulously kept the city's books, stacking grain, ships, taxes, religious pilgrims, and infrastructure repairs. For 20 years, he has mastered the ability to see the system as a whole, and he knows exactly where the tiny fracture is through which the entire structure will begin to leak. Right now, he sees that fracture. If the emperor delays sending Anna, the prince who has already dispatched 6,000 of his finest warriors to bleed for Byzantium, will not swallow the insult. If the prince refuses to swallow the insult, he will need to strike where the empire is simultaneously highly vulnerable and intensely valuable. He won't march on Constantinople, it's too far, and the walls are far too high. He won't march on Bulgaria, the Greeks are too strong there. That means there is only one logical target. Anastas is currently sitting right in the middle of that target. He stands up and walks to the window. Down below, in the harbor, dock workers are unloading wine. Up on the fortress wall, the garrison guards are changing shifts. By the marble fountain in the central square, women are filling clay pitchers with fresh water. Up on the hill, the bells in the basilica are ringing for vespers. This city suspects absolutely nothing. The strategist, a fundamentally decent and reasonably intelligent man, is busy doing exactly what he always does, monitoring the pechenegs and writing routine reports to the capital. It hasn't even crossed his mind to place two pieces of intelligence side by side. The prince demands Anna, and Anna is not being sent. Because that's not his job. Connecting disparate dots is the chancery's job. And the chancery in Constantinople is staffed by men exactly like Anastasi Friendman, who spend their time writing about the price of charcoal. Anastas returns to his desk, picks up his stylus, and for the first time that evening does something he has never, ever done before. He carves a short, concise list into the wax tablet, not an official report, a list just for himself. What do I know about the prince? What do I know about his fleet? What do I know about our walls? What do I know about our pipes? At the very last line, the stylus freezes. Anastas snaps the wooden cover shut over the tablet and slides it into the top drawer of his desk, burying it beneath a stack of old maintenance protocols for the city aqueduct. He isn't planning to commit treason or do anything illicit. He's simply going to watch the horizon a little more closely than usual. He throws his friend's letter into the hearth and watches it burn. This is another entirely professional habit. Never leave any physical evidence proving that you understood a situation long before anyone else did. That evening, Korsun goes to sleep in the absolute, unshakable certainty that its destiny is being decided in lucrative trade deals with Constantinople and in minor skirmishes with the pechenegs. In reality, its destiny is being decided within the great palace of Constantinople, inside the prince's great hall in Kyiv, and inside the top drawer of a desk in a small stone house on the southern slope of a Chersonesian hill. There is a little over a year left before the first hostile sails appear in the Quarantine Bay. Summer 989. The Great Palace, Constantinople. The corpses of the rebels slaughtered at Abydos haven't even gone cold. Basil's grand triumphal procession has just paraded down the Mysithi, main artery of the capital, and the populace still vividly remembers exactly who they owe their salvation to. 6,000 fierce northern warriors, whom the prince gave permission to remain in the imperial guard, now stand watch at the very gates of the palace. They stand there by virtue of the agreement signed in the autumn of 987, and by that exact same agreement, Anath Porphyrogenitus, sister of the Basileus, the one who locked herself in her chambers, weeping, "I go as into captivity," was supposed to have sailed for Kyiv last winter. She did not sail. There is no formal document in the palace archives formally canceling the treaty, and there never will be. Byzantine diplomacy does not operate that way. Byzantine diplomacy operates differently. Vladimir's embassy, which arrived to collect the bride at the beginning of the year, is received with immaculate courtesy. They are lavishly fed. They are housed in the finest quarters of the guest compound. They are escorted to magnificent services in the Hagia Sophia. And they are delayed. First, they claim the princess has fallen ill. Then, there's a sudden, pressing need to iron out the theological complexities of the marriage rite. Then, it's deemed an unfavorable season for a perilous sea voyage. Then, the departure is pushed to the next navigational season. Then, there's the need for yet another minor diplomatic clarification. This is exactly how the empire has expertly handled petitioners since the days of Justinian. They simply exhausted them. After 2 solid seasons of endless waiting, your average barbarian chieftain would just take whatever was offered. As a consolation prizes some silver, some bolts of silk, the minor relics of a second-tier saint, and go back home, telling his people that he managed to extort even more than he actually deserved. Basil II is entirely convinced that Vladimir is your average barbarian chieftain. It will be the single greatest miscalculation of his long reign. To understand exactly why the emperor is so confident, you have to put yourself in his shoes for a moment. Without judgment, sitting on the desk before him is a bill issued by a man who, a mere 5 years ago, was slicing throats to offer human sacrifices on a hilltop above the Dnieper. Paying this bill means handing over the ultimate, sacred symbol of the empire directly into the hands of this man. For 1,000 years, Byzantine princesses were birthed in the porphyry chamber for the explicit, holy purpose of ensuring they would never, ever end up in the bed of someone like him. This wasn't petty snobbery or capriciousness. This was the fundamental structure of the universe as understood in Constantinople. The empire was the divine intermediary between God and humanity, and its blood could not be tainted by the blood of those standing lower on the cosmological ladder. To give Anna away means openly admitting that this divine structure no longer exists. Basil looks at this grim reality and makes the only decision that seems obvious to him. He doesn't officially refuse, he merely delays, silently. During these agonizing months, Anna herself is transformed into a pawn used by her own brother. Her tears are not an elaborate court ruse, they are incredibly real. Greek chroniclers would later note, she is 26 years old, she boasts an education that few men of her own social circle could match, and she knows with terrifying clarity exactly what awaits her in Kyiv. Freezing cold, an alien tongue, a husband who has had, depending on whose count you trust, anywhere from 5 to 8 wives before her, a city where they recently butchered bulls at pagan altars and drenched wooden idols in hot blood. But Basil expertly weaponizes her tears. Every time Vladimir's embassy comes demanding a definitive answer, the Empress Mother or a managing eunuch finds a clever way to let them glimpse Anna from afar, weeping in the chapel or the gardens, and the embassy walks away, returning to the guest house with the exact same tired refrain. The princess's health is fragile, and the arduous journey is currently beyond her strength. It works flawlessly. For 8 long months. In Kyiv, they decode this diplomatic silence in 2 weeks. Vladimir does not draft angry letters of protest. He doesn't send a second, louder embassy. He doesn't demand groveling explanations. He does exactly what no one in Constantinople expects, because a barbarian chieftain simply isn't supposed to act this way. He doesn't march on Constantinople. Constantinople is much too far away, and its walls are even higher than Korsun's. He doesn't march into Thrace. The Greeks are far stronger on land there. He doesn't march on Bulgaria either. The Bulgarians are currently highly useful, alive, serving as a buffer and a counterweight to the empire. He studies the map and pinpoints the exact node where the empire is both highly vulnerable and intensely valuable. That node is the eye of the empire on the northern coast of the Black Sea. Through its bustling harbor flows every second sack of grain that feeds the capital from the north. Through its vibrant markets passes nearly the entirety of the empire's trade with the Pechenegs and the Khazars. Without it, Constantinople is completely blind across the vast expanse stretching from the Danube to the Caucasus Mountains. A strike on Korsun isn't a mere raid on an outlying province. It is a knife pressed directly to the throat of the capital from 2,000 kilometers away. Vladimir doesn't formally declare war. He simply gathers his fleet and sails. This decision, made in the Kievan Great Hall in the summer of 9089, is the pivot point of all Russian history, not because it will eventually lead to the baptism of Rus, but because, for the first time, a ruler of Rus operates on the international stage as a geopolitical strategist rather than a lucky warlord commanding a raiding party. Vladimir selects his target based not on its accessibility or its raw loot, but on its critical strategic value to his opponent. That is a Byzantine school of thought, turned against Byzantium itself. Where did a Kievan prince, who only 5 years prior was offering blood sacrifices to Perun, acquire this sophisticated school of thought? We don't know for certain, but we do know that in the Great Palace, hidden among the scribes of the 987 embassy, Vladimir saw an intensely observant, quietly calculating provincial Greek. Perhaps they spoke. Perhaps the Greek offered a subtle suggestion, not out of friendship, but simply because he, Anastas, couldn't resist showing off how much smarter he actually was than the men currently commanding him. Regardless, that conversation, if it happened, is about to pay off exponentially. When the very first exhausted riders from Crimea finally reach Constantinople, and they will only arrive weeks later because the coastline is already entirely occupied by the Rus, and the standard courier routes are severed, Basil II will not be shocked by the siege itself. He will be shocked by this. The prince, whom he had haughtily dismissed as a mere barbarian warlord, chose a target with more precision than any of the empire's own seasoned strategoi would have. Which means Vladimir is not a barbarian warlord. Which means the treaty that he, Basil had just so neatly buried beneath layers of diplomatic obfuscation will have to be violently exhumed, and he will have to pay the toll, this time, with heavy interest. But by the time Basil realizes this, in Korsun, inside a small stone house on the southern slope of the hill, the man who had foreseen this exact outcome over a year ago will have spent 4 quiet months watching the city's grain reserves slowly die. And he will understand, the longer Constantinople stalls, the fewer options he, Anastas, has left. Very soon, he will have exactly one option remaining. The 9th month of the siege, February 990. The food rations, calculated to last half a year, ran out in December. The grim inevitability Anastas saw in his ledgers on the very first day of the siege arrived exactly on schedule, and now everyone can see it. In Chersonesus, they are still desperately attempting to live the way people in a civilized Byzantine city live. Every morning, the liturgy is chanted in the basilica in the main square. In the grand thermal baths, they still heat the water, even though all the firewood is long gone, and they are currently burning shattered, priceless furniture. The aristocrats in the upper city hotly debate the intricate theological nuances of the Monophysite heresy with the exact same passion their grandfathers did a century ago. Every single morning, the strategist climbs the tower and stares out at the horizon. But down below in the lower city, near the port warehouses, the lines have already formed. Bread is distributed by drawing lots. There is absolutely nothing left to sell in the market. 2 days ago, a man had his throat slit right outside the church of St. Leontius over half a measure of flour. The strategist knows all about this. The strategist just keeps staring at the horizon. There is no sign of the imperial fleet. Anastas doesn't climb the tower. Anastas sits in his chancery and, for the second time this week, rereads the exact same document. It's an old city council protocol, a wildly mundane record detailing repairs to the water pipes, written 20 years ago. There are no state secrets in it, just a dry list of completed labor, where to replace the lead joints, where to add more reinforcing stone, and the exact coordinates of the sector where the aqueduct runs closest to the surface of the earth. Anastas knows this document perfectly by heart. 20 years ago, he was the one who drafted it. Let's unpack this moment slowly. What does it actually mean to write a treasonous letter to a besieging enemy camp? It is not an impulsive act. It is not the desperate, panicked decision of a starving man. Anastas isn't starving. The Pertuans have their own private stockpiles, and they will be the very last to run out of food. And this isn't the zealous fanaticism of a political defector. Anastas has zero faith in these new northern gods, nor does he believe in some grand historical mission of Rus. This is a job. Anastas has spent his entire life doing one thing: calculating and documenting. And he knows exactly when a system is already dead, even if the people trapped inside it are still moving their limbs. Korsun died in December, the moment the last ships carrying grain failed to arrive. Now it's February. The city is dying a second time, this time literally. And Anastas also sees a second system, the one currently encamped in Strzelecka Bay. Vladimir's army spent the entire brutal winter huddled beneath the walls. This is incredibly rare, almost unprecedented. Steppe nomads and northern warbands usually lift a siege when the bitter cold sets in. Vladimir did not lift it. That means the man sitting on the hill is not a barbarian raider who just came for quick plunder. It means he came for something highly specific, and he is absolutely not leaving without it. For the very first time in his life, Anastas sees a ruler whose behavior actually yields to his cold,
bureaucratic calculations.
He picks up his stylus. Not to write to Vladimir, not quite yet. He makes a short list. What do I lose if the city holds? What do I lose if the city is taken by storm? What do I gain if I am the one who hands the city over? In the first column, nothing. The empire isn't sending a fleet. If they were going to, they would have sent it 3 months ago. In the second column, absolutely everything. A Varangian storming a breach does not pause to ask who is a wealthy protean and who is a lowly fisherman. The opulent estates of the nobility in the upper city will be sacked first, because those are the houses actually worth sacking. At the third column, Anastas pauses. If he is the one who hands over the city personally, based on his own calculations, on his own terms, he becomes the only man in Korsun who negotiated with the prince directly, the only man whose name the prince will actually remember, and most crucially, the only man who understands the complex economic machinery of the city well enough to be of any real use to the conqueror on the morning after the city falls. At this exact moment, something happens that future historians will grandly label treason, church scholars will call divine providence, and Anastas himself calls absolutely nothing. Anastas simply closes the old water pipe maintenance protocol and begins drafting a new document. It is short, written on a strip of parchment the length of his palm. What exactly was written there, we will hear in the very next chapter of this story, words preserved by the chronicler with such shocking literal exactness that even 1,000 years later it is glaringly obvious they weren't copied from hearsay, but transcribed directly from a physical document someone held in their own hands. But right now, what matters is this. Anastas rolls the parchment into a tight little tube. He takes it with him and climbs for the first time all winter up to that same northern tower overlooking the Quarantine Bay, where the watchpost is freezing through the season. The guards know him. The protean is doing rounds and inspecting the posts, standard procedure. They turn away. On the tower, he walks up to one of the archers. He asks for a bow. The archer, a boy of about 17, hands it over without asking questions. Anastas does not know how to shoot well. He is perfectly aware of this, but the distance to the closest Russian tent is less than 200 paces, and the wind is blowing in the right direction. He secures the parchment to the shaft of the arrow with a thin piece of twine, meticulously, with the exact same practiced care he used to tie lead seals onto imperial decrees for 20 years. And for the first time in the life of a Byzantine bureaucrat who had spent 40 years safely behind a desk with a wax tablet, he does something that is absolutely not outlined in any imperial job description. He draws back the bowstring. The bowstring is drawn taut, but before the arrow flies, we have to freeze time. Because the events of the next 3 seconds have reached us through 3 entirely different historical accounts, and all 3 aggressively contradict one another. Version 1. The Primary Chronicle, Kyiv, early 12th century. The chronicler writes, "A certain man of Korsun, named Anastas, shot an arrow into the camp of the Rus carrying a message." And he provides the exact text of this message in Church Slavonic, a single, devastating line. "The springs which are behind you to the east, from their water flows through a pipe. Dig and intercept it." 18 words in English. Coordinates, instructions, 0 rhetoric. This is the crucial detail. Chroniclers of the 12th century did not write like this. They loved to embellish the speech of their characters with sweeping biblical parallels, dramatic laments, and rhetorical exclamations. Yet here we have the dry, bureaucratic memo of an accountant who who is deeply accustomed to the fact that every extra word costs money. The consensus of philologists, this single line was almost certainly transcribed directly from the actual physical document which ended up in the princely chancery and was filed away there for decades. Version 2. Yahya of Antioch, an Arabic-speaking Christian historian, writing around 1015. Yahya writes in Arabic, in Antioch, 25 years after the events, and his account is entirely independent of both Kyiv and Constantinople. His take on Korsun is much shorter. The city fell, but there is absolutely no mention of an arrow. In Yahya's version, Vladimir simply takes Chersonesus by force and then dispatches a blunt demand to Constantinople to hand over the bride. Version 3. Leo the Deacon, Constantinople, late 10th century. A contemporary of the events who personally witnessed the slaughter at Abydos. He mentions the capture of Korsun only in passing, referring to it dismissively as a disaster that befell the Romaioi in Taurica. No names of traitors, no severed aqueducts. So what does archaeology say? Excavations of Chersonesus, which have been ongoing since the 19th century and continue to this day, have revealed the truth. The ancient aqueduct of the city did indeed originate from the eastern hills. It did indeed run directly beneath the footprint of the future Russian siege lines, and the pipes were indeed buried remarkably shallow at one specific sector, sitting just 1.5 meters below the surface. Hacking through them, if you knew the exact spot, was a half-day's work for a handful of men with shovels, meaning the technical feasibility of the event described in the Primary Chronicle is fully confirmed by the dirt itself. And there's one more detail we need to address directly, because it's the elephant in the room for this entire episode. The date, 988, the year of the baptism of Rus, is an accepted convention that solidified primarily in the 20th century, largely following the massive 1,000-year anniversary celebrations in 1988. Before that, academic debate flowed much more freely. If we read Yahya carefully, and Yahya dates his events utilizing solar eclipses and the rigid Syriac calendar, meaning his timeline cannot be easily shifted, the actual sequence looks like this. The marriage treaty happens in 987, the arrival of the Russian corps in 988, the total destruction of Phokas at Abydos in April 989. The siege of Korsun spans from the summer of 989 to early 990. The city falls in the spring of 990. The baptism of Vladimir and the royal wedding in 990, and the mass baptism of Kyiv in 990 or 991. What school textbooks neatly label as 988 is just a convenient, tidy number into which a 1,000-piece historical puzzle has been violently crammed. The real history is far messier, and it dragged on for nearly 3 years. In this episode, we are following Yahya's timeline, not because we dislike the Primary Chronicle, but because Yahya was closer to the events as they happened and had absolutely no political reason to lie. So, February 990, the northern tower of Korsun. Anastas stands with the drawn bow. Here is what we know for a fact. The city's aqueduct truly was severed, and that act truly decided the outcome of the siege. Anastas's name figures prominently as Vladimir's chief informant in absolutely all Russian sources without exception, in every later mention of him. And Vladimir himself later pulls Anastas into his closest inner circle, which would make zero sense if Anastas hadn't played a monumental role in this exact story. Did he actually shoot the arrow himself? Did he personally tie the parchment to the shaft with his own hands, or did he smuggle the note out via a defector? We will never truly know, but he did something, and in our episode, it will be the arrow.
The bowstring slips from his fingers, a sharp, dry snap.
The arrow arcs up into the twilight sky over the quarantine bay, tracing a steep parabola, and plunges into the dirt about 20 paces to the left of the tent Anastas was actually aiming for, right next to a campfire where a group of Varangians are finishing off a late evening stew. One of them, barely looking, yanks the arrow out by the shaft. He spots the tightly wound twine near the arrowhead. He unties it. The parchment makes it into Vladimir's tent an hour later. First, it is handed to a centurion who cannot read. The centurion passes it to a scribe. The scribe brings it to the prince. Vladimir unrolls the palm-length strip of parchment. It is dimly lit inside the tent. A single oil lamp flickers on an iron tripod. The prince reads the Slavic words slowly, his lips moving as he sounds out the syllables, exactly how everyone read in an era where literacy was a rare, ceremonial undertaking. The springs which are behind you to the east. And it is precisely here that the chronicler places a phrase in Vladimir's mouth that will be dutifully quoted for 1,000 years. If this comes to pass, I shall be baptized. We must be brutally honest. This phrase is almost certainly a much later literary invention. It is far too poetic, far too perfectly symmetrical, far too cleanly serving the primary thematic thrust of the chronicle, the idea that the fall of Korsun and Vladimir's baptism were inexorably linked by grand divine design. The real prince, sitting in a freezing tent outside Korsun, almost certainly grunted something significantly shorter and far more profane. But structurally, the chronicler isn't lying. From this exact moment, a thought begins to crystallize in Vladimir's mind, a thought that in 5 months' time will blossom into the foundational act of a brand new state religion. If this mighty city is destined to fall from a fatal blow delivered by one of its own Greek bureaucrats, then it means the empire itself implicitly recognizes the prince's right to take this city. And whoever recognizes his right to the city recognizes his right to everything else, including the princess. Vladimir carefully rolls the parchment back up. He doesn't burn it. He sets it aside, placing it inside an iron-bound travel chest. That tiny strip of parchment will remain locked in the princely treasury for the next 30 years. And the man who will eventually take it out of that chest in the year 1018, on his very last day of service in Rus, will be the exact same man who wrote it. But for now, Vladimir stands up, steps out of the tent, and issues his first command of the day. Not storm the walls,
Not build siege towers, dig.
10 shovels, that was all it took. The next morning, the Varangians march out to a patch of ground 1.5 miles east of the walls, exactly where the note pointed. It's a dry, rocky steppe where locals graze goats. There is absolutely zero surface evidence that right beneath their boots runs the main artery keeping one of the wealthiest cities in the empire alive. An hour later, the shovels clang sharply against stone. It's the protective slab covering the pipe. By high noon, the aqueduct, laid down during the reign of Emperor Zeno 600 years prior, has been violently hacked apart in 3 separate places. The rushing water is diverted down into a useless ravine. Korsun doesn't know it yet. The city finds out gradually, the way any massive, complex machine slowly dies. First, the upper fountain in the plaza by the basilica stops flowing. A day later, the lower fountain. By the evening of the second day, the private household cisterns in the upper city run completely dry. By the morning of the fourth day, the residents of the lower city are desperately drinking from stagnant rain barrels choked with dead flies. And then Korsun does what it hadn't done for the entire 9 months of the siege. It begins to scream. The strategos steps out to address the surging mob near the sea gates, and, for the first time, he sees faces twisted not by the terror of the Varangians outside, but by the terror of themselves. The terror of what these civilized people will do to each other tomorrow when the water is truly gone. He turns around, returns to his palace, and, for the first time since the siege began, he throws the heavy iron bolts on his doors from the inside. At this precise moment, inside the small stone house on the southern slope, Anastas is packing his belongings. A sturdy leather case stuffed with scrolls, 15 years' worth of working ledgers, quietly smuggled out of the chancery the day before. A small wooden box holding his official seals. His molybdenum, his heavy lead seal ring. He takes neither money nor jewels. This is the cold, correct calculation of a man walking out to surrender. Bringing wealth means you are asking to be robbed. Bringing state documents means you are proving your administrative value. By the 5th day without water, the strategos convenes the Council of Proteons. The voices are violently split. Some demand a suicidal sally out the gates. Others scream to throw the doors open and beg for mercy. And when the strategos finally asks, who will go as a parliamentarian to parley with the prince, Anastas stands up. I will go. The strategos stares at him for a long time. At this moment, he probably understands everything, not with hard proof, but with the boned, deep intuition of an old administrator. Anastas volunteered for a suicide mission far too quickly. He looked far too confident. He was dressed far too immaculately for an emissary from a dying city. But he just nods silently. It is his final decision in office. The walk to the prince's tent takes less than half an hour, and for the very first time in our story, 2 men who only knew of each other by proxy finally come face to face. Vladimir is sitting on a crude wooden camp stool, not a gilded throne, not on an elevated dais. Spread out on the makeshift table before him is a map of the city, and resting deliberately on top of that map is an unrolled strip of parchment. That very same parchment, the note about the water pipes. The prince intentionally left it out in plain sight. Anastas enters. He bows briefly, a crisp, bureaucratic nod, exactly the way you bow to an equal, acknowledging only his de facto power over the situation. Vladimir notices this. He doesn't react. The Primary Chronicle did not preserve their conversation. This is the one singular moment in this entire episode where we have to be completely honest. We have no idea what they said to each other. The translator took those words to the grave, but we do know the final result. An hour later, Anastas walks out of the tent, but no longer as a parliamentarian. He will not return to the city. He will be given his own tent, right next to the command staff, not as a captive, not as an honored guest, but as something entirely new, a role for which the military hierarchy of the era doesn't even have a name yet. The next morning, Korsun surrenders without a siege assault, without mass bloodshed. What Anastas actually offered the prince, we can easily reverse engineer from the aftermath. A guarantee of physical immunity for the citizens, executed, there were no massacres or pogroms. The preservation of the basilicas and holy relics, executed. The organized extraction of a portion of the city's wealth back to Kyiv, executed. This hoard would go down in history as the Korsun booty. And the personal clause, a seat as an advisory steward to the prince for Anastas himself. That last point is the crux of it all. Anastas didn't sell out his city for gold. Anastas traded his city for a promotion. It is precisely the kind of power he could never have attained in Byzantium in his entire lifetime. In the morning, Vladimir rides into Korsun through the main gates. They are unbarred from the inside by the townspeople themselves, not because they are overjoyed, but because they were explicitly promised that the water would return the second the Rus entered.
The water returns exactly 3 hours later. The strategist is arrested and shipped to Kyiv as a high-value hostage. The city treasury is immediately sealed by the prince's scribes, and by the evening of that very first day, the grueling labor for which this entire campaign was launched begins in the port. Space is being frantically cleared in the holds of the longships for a very specific cargo. Not gold, not steel, not grain, the massive marble columns of ancient temples. 4 magnificent copper horses from the central plaza, 2 colossal bronze statues, the stone tomb of Saint Clement of Romea Pope, martyred during the reign of Trajan, and buried, according to legend, right here in the surf. Vladimir isn't carting wealth out of the conquered city. He is carting away the empire itself in miniature, its quarried stone, its cast bronze, its holy saints, the literal building blocks from which a brand new center of the Christian world will be constructed in Kyiv. But the most valuable asset in that cargo is neither the stone nor the bronze. The most valuable asset is the man who is currently standing on the deck of the prince's flagship, meticulously logging every single item loaded into the holds onto his wax tablet. In Constantinople, upon receiving the horrifying news of the city's fall, Basil II, as Yahya of Antioch notes, immediately scrambles an embassy to finally dispatch Anna to the north. 8 months of his elegant, stalling diplomacy were utterly annihilated in 3 days by a single provincial accountant who knew how to read the ledgers. Anastas is 39 years old. In his first life, he was an overqualified, underappreciated clerk in the Chersonesian chancery. In his second life, he will become the first minister of finance for a state that doesn't even officially exist yet. But before this new state can be fully realized, it will have to adopt a new faith. And for the first time in our story, Anastas won't merely be a passive observer of this monumental shift, but the man actively drafting its blueprints. Summer 990, the Black Sea. Midway between the Bosphorus and the shores of Crimea, 2 fleets pass each other in the deep waters. One is heading north, 4 massive, sail-driven imperial dromons, and aboard the flagship is Anna, the Porphyrogenita. She is escorted by 2 high-ranking metropolitans, an unnamed retinue of 40 attendants, and a solid silver cross the size of a man, forged specifically for the baptism of a barbarian. The other fleet is heading south. No, it's not heading south. This fleet is stationary, waiting in the port of Korsun, a massive armada of princely longships, riding so dangerously low in the water that the waves lap at the gunwales. Their holds are packed with 4 copper horses, 2 bronze statues, and the heavy marble columns of ancient temples. They are waiting for this exact same wind to shift and blow them back north.
The ships of the empire are bringing a princess to a barbarian. The ships of the barbarian are bringing the empire to Kyiv.
And they are entirely oblivious to this cosmic cross-traffic. Hundreds of nautical miles of dark water separate them. Anna steps off onto the Chersonesian docks, uttering the exact same words the Primary Chronicle would later record verbatim. Words that require zero translation to anyone listening to this episode. I go as a captive. I would rather die here. Waiting to meet her on the pier is not Vladimir. Vladimir is conspicuously absent. This is a crucial detail that is almost always scrubbed from popular retellings, and that's a mistake. The prince intentionally does not show up to greet her arrival. This is the pure, unadulterated Byzantine school of diplomacy, executed flawlessly by a man who 5 years ago was burning sacrifices on a hill above the Dnieper. I didn't come to you, you came to me. Instead, Anna is greeted by Anastas, the former Chersonesian civil servant, whom the princely chancery now officially titles the oikonomist, the steward. He is dressed in pristine, immensely expensive robes that are neither Varangian nor barbarian. He speaks to the princess in flawless Greek, using the crisp, aristocratic dialect of Constantinople, having completely switched off the provincial Chersonesian accent he learned to bury 20 years ago. For Anna, this is her first massive shock in Korsun. She is being welcomed by one of her own. The royal wedding is set in that very same basilica on the hill, the exact one where all the people Vladimir is currently loading onto ships bound for Kyiv used to pray. A sprawling Byzantine ceremony, heavy silk pavlokas draped over the shoulders of the bride and groom, shimmering golden Stephana crowns held aloft over their heads by the witnesses. The Metropolitan Anna brought with her chants the prayers in sonorous Greek. The crowd packed into the basilica listens to this utterly alien language and slowly realizes that this is exactly what the sound of a new era sounds like. Two crucial details you need to remember. First, standing right behind Vladimir's shoulder at the wedding is not a battle-scarred warlord. It is not a loyal Varangian guardsman. It is Anastas. Technically, this is just the spot for the witness and translator, but Byzantine protocol, the strict visual language Anna was raised in, reads positioning very differently, and she reads it perfectly. Here is the man the prince implicitly trusts in matters where you must understand the inner workings of the system. Second, right before the wedding, the arrested strategist of Korsun is hauled before Vladimir and Anathi, very same man who had silently nodded to Anastas in the council hall. He is pardoned and released. This is Anna's diplomatic gift to her brother, the emperor. The old administrator gets to sail home with his head still attached to his neck. It is also her very first political maneuver in her new role. And it is the first clear signal that a marriage which began with the words, "I would rather die here," will morph into 40 years of relentless political labor for the benefit of her husband. A famous legend has been preserved in the chronicles. Shortly before the wedding, Vladimir fell deathly ill, went entirely blind, and miraculously regained his sight only at the exact moment he stepped into the baptismal font. This is a canonical, textbook miracle, heavily featured in every Russian ecclesiastical text from the Primary Chronicle to the Lives of the Saints.
But we must be honest, neither Yahya, nor Leo the Deacon, nor any of the synchronous Byzantine sources even hint at the prince suffering from blindness. This is a pious religious tradition, retroactively engineered in Kievan monasteries a century or a century and a half after the events, designed to explain, after the fact, why a great and terrifying pagan warlord would suddenly choose to be baptized. It's difficult for an audience to accept that sometimes rulers adopt a faith not because they were struck by divine lightning, but out of cold, hard political calculation. A lightning strike is just much easier to digest. One way or another, in that same basilica, a day after the wedding, a man whom Byzantium had considered the ultimate nightmare of its northern borders for 20 years, steps down into a massive stone font, chiseled back in the 4th century, to baptize Roman legionnaires. And he emerges from the water as Basil. That is his new Christian name, taken directly in honor of the Basileus who had just handed over his sister. Whether out of biting irony or complete sincerity, we don't know. History will remember him under both names. His pagan name, Vladimir, his Christian name, Basil, will be almost entirely forgotten. And meanwhile, standing on the deck of one of the heavily overloaded princely longships in the port of Korsun, Anastas crosses out the very last line in his ledger that ties him to his past life. The position of protion of Chersonesus is officially closed. A new one has opened. This, after all, was the entire point of the exercise. Autumn 990. The baptismal font in the Chersonesian basilica. What exactly Vladimir feels as he rises from that water, we will never truly know. This is the single most heavily guarded, opaque moment in the prince's entire biography throughout his reign. And that opacity is no accident. Every single later source, both ecclesiastical and secular, has a vested interest in portraying this baptism as a profound, shattering, internal transfiguration. It literally cannot be portrayed any other way otherwise. The entire divine legitimacy of the new state of Rus hangs in a void. This is exactly why the Primary Chronicle insists on the blindness and the miraculous healing. This is why the saints' lives insist on divine visions. This is why later icon painters always depict Vladimir's face in the font glowing with holy illumination. But we, knowing everything we now know, are forced to concede that the man who stepped out of that font was precisely the same man who stepped into it.
A ruthlessly calculating, deeply experienced, 40-year-old sovereign, accustomed to brutally weighing the cost of a deal in his great hall. Only Noe was signing with a new signature. But what we can definitively say is what Vladimir does immediately after his baptism. And that speaks louder than any internal spiritual feelings. He dispatches his first fast rider to Kyiv with a single brutal order: tear down Perun, the very same towering idol of Perun that he, Vladimir, had personally erected on the hill above the Dnieper 5 years prior, and at whose wooden feet he had offered human sacrifices. The rider will gallop ahead, easily outpacing the heavy fleet laden with copper horses, and will reach Kyiv long before the prince's armada. By the time Vladimir returns, the pagan sanctuary will already be a pile of splinters. This is not a religious ritual. This is a top-down administrative directive, issued under the signature of a man who is fully accustomed to having his directives obeyed without question. And this is exactly how Russian Christianity begins, not with a whispered prayer, with an executive order. During these days, Anastas doesn't leave the prince's side. He's not a bodyguard, he's not a confessor, and he's not a mere interpreter. He is something entirely different,
a role for which, as we noted, the military hierarchy still lacks a proper term. It is a completely new position, and they are actively inventing it on the fly. Technically, the title is oikonomos, the manager of assets, but the newly converted prince's assets in Korsun currently consist of 40 longships packed to the brim with quarried marble. And the chief objective of the oikonomos right now isn't simply to inventory the marble. The chief objective is to teach the rough Russian craftsmen who will be sailing to Kyiv alongside that marble what in God's name they are supposed to actually do with it. Anastas handles this personally. He handpicks the Greek stonemasons, the master mosaicists, and a lead architect. He drafts the preliminary budget and material estimates for a future church in Kyiv, a church that does not yet exist, and the likes of which has never existed on Eastern Slavic soil. Built of stone, Byzantine in design, crowned with a dome. There are 38 separate line items in that estimate. Anastas knows all 38 intimately. 20 years pushing wax in the Chersonesian chancery were not wasted. And there is one more monumental thing Anastas does during these days quietly, without any direct princely decree, entirely on his own initiative. He sits Vladimir down and explains the concept of the tithe, not in a theological sense, in a strictly technical sense. A tithe is a highly efficient Byzantine model wherein the state legally transfers a fixed portion of its sovereign revenues to the church, exactly 1/10. This isn't a charitable donation. It is a codified line item in the state budget. And for a young state, it is vastly more profitable than it sounds. Instead of painstakingly building a sprawling local administrative apparatus from scratch, you instantly acquire a ready-made, highly motivated network of parishes. They will conduct censuses of your subjects, officially log births and deaths, register property deeds, and collect taxes on that property on your behalf. In exchange for essentially running your state bureaucracy, they keep 1/10 of the cut. Vladimir listens in silence and nods. 6 years later, in Kyiv, this exact fiscal schematic will be literally built into the very foundation of the first stone church in Rus. And that church will be named in direct honor of the scheme Anastas proposed, the Church of the Tithes. But that will be in Kyiv, and it will be in 6 years. For now, the very last longship is being loaded at the Chersonesian docks. Into its hold, they lower the heaviest prize of all, the tomb of St. Clement of Rome, a massive stone sarcophagus that, according to legend, had rested in Korsun for 900 years. Vladimir is taking it to Kyiv as both a conqueror's trophy and a holy relic simultaneously. From the strict perspective of Byzantine canon law, this is blatant sacrilege. You absolutely cannot seize the relics of a major saint without the explicit blessing of the patriarch. But from the perspective of Byzantine geopolitics, it's a bizarrely convenient gift because Clement was a pope of Rome, not Constantinople, meaning his relocation to Rus vastly elevates the prestige of the new northern center, without directly challenging the spiritual monopoly of Constantinople. Anastas understands both of these complex legal readings perfectly, and he politely allows the prince to worry about neither of them. The fleet sails out of the quarantine bay in the autumn of 990. Aboard the lead longship are Vladimir and Anna. Trailing just behind is the vessel carrying the tomb of Clement. Further back, the 4 copper horses, the massive marble columns, the towering bronze statues. Bringing up the rear is a ship whose hold is packed with Greek stonemasons and an architect. And right in the dead center, of this sprawling armada, standing on the deck of an ordinary longship, devoid of any royal banners or fawning retinue, is a man holding a rolled scroll and a stylus. He isn't looking back at the fading Chersonesian lighthouse. He is looking forward, toward a place where, in 6 years, a monumental cathedral will stand, built entirely upon his, Anastas, meticulous calculations, where in 20 years a sprawling national tax system, carbon copied from the Byzantine model, will be fully operational, drafted by his own hand, and where in 28 years that exact same hand will unlock the gates of the city to a hostile foreign army. But that is a story for the upcoming chapters of our history. For now, the longships slice into the open sea, and not a single soul aboard those decks truly comprehends what they are bringing with them. It isn't quarried marble, it isn't a captive princess, it isn't even a new faith. It is an apparatus, one that will outlive them all.
Kyiv, 991. The third month after their return, Anastas is sitting in a small chamber assigned to him inside the princely dedinets, the inner citadel. Resting on the desk before him is a wooden board coated in smooth wax, the exact same one he used in Korsun. A man's habits travel with him. Scrawled on the wax is a list of households obligated to pay the tithe, or rather, a desperate attempt at a list. The fundamental problem is this. In Byzantium, every single household has been meticulously logged in a state registry for centuries. It has a specific tax code, it bears the name of the head of the family, and it contains an exact record of how much land they work and precisely how much tax that land yielded the previous year. This system works seamlessly because, before Anastas came along, thousands of clerks had been obsessively maintaining it for a millennium. In Kyiv, there isn't a single registry, not one. This isn't because Vladimir is a lazy administrator.
It's because the very concept of an individual household as a measurable unit of taxation simply does not exist in the Slavic world. There is the clan, there is the prince's retinue, there is the poliudi, the brutal annual tribute-gathering tour where the prince rides through his subjugated territories and physically extracts whatever he can carry from each community. Exactly how much is taken is violently negotiated by the village elders, not dictated by a ledger. The rigid Byzantine concept of a tithe physically cannot fit into this chaotic system. Anastas realizes this by the end of his first month on the job. And he does exactly what any highly experienced administrator does when violently colliding with an insurmountable reality. He stops trying to surmount it. Instead of a registry of individual households, he drafts a registry of entire tribal communities.
Instead of a strict per capita silver tithe, he institutes an in-kind tax, collected partly in grain, partly in honey, partly in furs. Instead of a rigid annual tax deadline, he creates a 3-year cycle, piggybacking seamlessly onto the pollution tribute tours that already functionally exist. Instead of imposing alien Byzantine job titles, he uses Slavic ones. Instead of a strategos, there is a posadnik. Instead of a logothete, there is a tune. This is no longer the Byzantine tithe. This is a brilliant hybrid, borrowing its core ideology from Byzantium, but using raw Rus mechanics to make the engine run.
And it is precisely in this hybridized form that the system will survive for the next 600 years. Meanwhile, the construction project is underway. Up on the hill, on the exact spot where Perrin's idol stood just 2 years ago, the Greek master builders, the ones Anastas hand-picked in Korsun, are laying the foundation. The brick they are using is much thinner and wider than what the locals know. It is Byzantine plinthos, fired to a pale rosy hue. The mortar binding it together is tsemyanka, a mixture of crushed ceramic and lime that cures to a strength utterly unnatural for mere stone. Built directly into the lower tiers of the walls are hollow clay jugs positioned with their necks facing inward, golosniki, acoustic resonators that, in 30 years, will give the church choir an incredibly rich, multi-dimensional sound. The Slavic carpenters, who have spent their entire lives hacking structures out of raw timber, watch the Greeks work in sullen, highly suspicious silence. The Greeks do not speak Slavic. The Slavs do not speak Greek. Walking between the two camps is Anastas, literally the only man on the entire construction site who can understand both sides. The cathedral will be named after the fiscal scheme Anastas engineered back in Korsun, the Church of the Tithes, the very first stone sanctuary in Rus, and the very first building on Eastern Slavic soil specifically designed and constructed to house a state budget. Not everyone in Kyiv is thrilled about this development. The warlord Dobrynya Vladimir's uncle on his mother's side, the exact same man who personally erected the idol of Perun on this very hill 5 years ago, marches into the princely council and asks a highly inconvenient question. Why do we have a Greek guarding the treasury? The question sounds deceptively simple, but buried within it is an entire political manifesto. The prince is supposed to be surrounded by his own people, his blood retinue, his clan, his land. Putting a Greek in charge of the treasury signals that the princely wealth no longer belongs to the warriors who bled for it. It now belongs to a formalized state, a state that doesn't even fully exist yet. Vladimir doesn't give Dobrynya a direct answer. He answers with a political maneuver. He ships Dobrynya off to Novgorod to forcefully baptize the freezing north, which is violently resisting the new faith. It is simultaneously a high honor and a calculated political exile. Anastas remains in Kyiv. By 996, the Church of the Tithes is officially consecrated. Standing right in front of it, dominating the newly paved plaza, are those exact same 4 copper horses and 2 bronze statues hauled all the way from Korsun. They aren't just pretty decorations. They are a massive geopolitical statement. Kyiv has now earned the right to stand on the exact same plaza as the ancient gods of antiquity. The city has officially become the heir. Anastas is formally appointed as the oikonomos of the cathedral, the supreme keeper of the treasury, and the master of the tithe. He is 45 years old. He is standing at the absolute zenith of his second life, the life for which he once drew back a bowstring on a freezing Korsun watchtower. 19 years later, in the summer of 1015, inside the princely palace at Berestove, Vladimir Sviatoslavich will breathe his last. The Grand Prince of Kyiv, the baptizer of Rus, the brother-in-law of the Byzantine emperor. Standing over his lifeless body will be 3 people: Princess Anna, the Metropolitan, and the oikonomos of the Church of the Tithes. Out of those 3, exactly 1 person knows precisely where the entirety of the state treasury is physically hidden, and it isn't the Metropolitan. The year 1018, August, Kyiv. 3 brutal years have passed since Anastas stood over Vladimir's corpse, and in those 3 years, the nascent state of Rus, which Anastas spent 30 years painstakingly knitting together, has violently shattered into pieces far faster than he ever built it. Sviatopolk murdered 3 of his own brothers, Boris, Gleb, and Sviatoslav. Yaroslav marched out of Novgorod with a massive Varangian war band and violently deposed Sviatopolk. Sviatopolk then begged his father-in-law for help, the Polish king Boleslav the Brave, and in August of 1018, the Polish army, heavily reinforced by German and Hungarian mercenaries, crushes Yaroslav's forces at the river Bug and marches directly on Kyiv. On August 22, 1018, the heavy wooden gates of Kyiv are unbarred from the inside, without a siege assault, without mass bloodshed. This has happened once before, 28 years ago, in a completely different city.
Boleslav rides into Kyiv on his war horse, and according to the Chronicle of Thietmar of Merseburger, synchronous source who wrote about these events while the ink was still wet, the very first thing he does is strike the Golden Gate with his drawn sword. This is a highly symbolic gesture. In Polish military tradition, such a strike signifies that the city has officially been taken under the supreme protection of the monarch. On his second day in the city, Boleslav heads straight to the Church of the Tithes. He isn't there to pray, he is there to inspect the treasury. Waiting to greet him at the heavy doors is an elderly man dressed in a modest, dark robe. He looks to be about 67 years old, quiet and unassuming, like all good accountants, bowing deeply but entirely devoid of groveling subservience, and speaking to the king in flawless Latina language absolutely no one else in Kyiv knows how to speak except for him. It is Anastas. Thietmar didn't record their conversation,
but he did record the final result.
A few weeks later, when Boleslav abandons Kyiv and begins the long march back to Poland, his heavy baggage train will carry the massive ecclesiastical treasury of the Church of the Tithes, a significant portion of Vladimir's personal princely hoard, priceless holy relics and golden utensils hoarded over 30 years, and the oikonomos himself, Anastas, having voluntarily accepted a highly lucrative position at the court of the Polish king. This is Anastas' second great betrayal in life,
and it is a flawless, perfect mirror image of his first.
Put the two scenes side by side. 989, Constantinople. Basil II sits in the great palace and makes the calculated decision not to hand over his promised sister because the geopolitical circumstances have shifted, and a word given to a barbarian can simply be broken. That is the standard Byzantine norm of behavior when dealing with a weakening partner. 1018, Kyiv. Anastas of Korsun sits in the Church of the Tithes and makes the calculated decision not to hand over the keys to the treasury to Yaroslav because the geopolitical circumstances have shifted, and a word given to the crumbling dynasty of Vladimir can simply be broken. It is the exact same Byzantine norm, only this time it isn't an emperor applying it to a barbarian, it's a Byzantine applying it to Rus. Anastas learned absolutely everything from the empire, including, most crucially, exactly how you are supposed to betray it. And this is the final answer to the riddle we posed at the very beginning of this episode.
Anastas is neither a traitor nor a patriot. He is neither a starry-eyed idealist nor a cartoonish cynic. He is an auditor. His entire life, he placed his bets squarely on whoever held the strongest hand, and then he simply walked away with the casino's vault. In 988, the strongest hand belonged to Vladimir. In 1018, the strongest hand belonged to Boleslav. Had Yaroslav somehow magically proven to be the strongest in 1019, Anastas would have calmly defected back to him, and he would have drafted a beautifully airtight legal justification for doing so. He served no other gods. Anastas would live out the rest of his days peacefully in Poland. He pops up in the chronicles a few more times, operating as Bolesław's highly trusted confidant in matters of ecclesiastical finance and state treasury management. The exact date of his death remains unknown. His grave has never been found.
But what was found in a significantly later historical source is a very brief, tantalizing note stating that deep within the monastic archives in Gniezno, as late as the 13th century, there lay a heavy scroll containing the ledger of the Russian valuables brought out of Kyiv in the year of our Lord 1018. The ledger was written entirely in Greek, in a meticulous, flawless bureaucratic handwriting, the exact same handwriting that 20 years prior had documented routine repairs to a water pipe in Chersonesus. Religions are born, and borders are violently redrawn by the swords of kings. But they are ultimately managed and survived by the quills of accountants and traitors.
Anastas of Korsun died somewhere in Poland, in an unmarked grave, entirely surrounded by the very documents he himself had drafted. But the sprawling state he helped architect in Kyiv, complete with its hybridized tithe scheme, its tribal registries, and its soaring stone cathedral standing directly over the ashes of Perun, that state vastly outlived him. It outlived his daughters, his grandsons, and his great-grandsons, and it continues to live to this very day. Anastas built an empire with a quill and a ledger, but before you can efficiently tax souls, you have to forcefully baptize them, and before you can baptize them, you have to break them. In Kyiv, they manage this through soft persuasion and heavy silver. In Novgorod, they failed entirely, and so the prince sent the one man who had never once in his life possessed the capacity to persuade anyone gently: his uncle, the warlord.
The man who was once the high priest of Perun, his name was Dobrynya, and the true bloody cost of this new faith will be the subject of our next episode.